Before we get started, we just want to thank Old Republic Surety for sponsoring this episode of Let's Get Surety, as well as NASBP virtual seminars. For more information on Old Republic Surety, visit www.orsurety.com. Now on to our show.
You're listening to Let's Get Surety. Let me hear your bonding talk with Kat Shamapande.
Hey everyone, it's Kat Shamapande. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Let's Get Surety. I've got with me today my co-host, Mark McCallum, CEO of NASBP. Hey Mark, thanks for being on.
Absolutely, Kat. I'm really looking forward to it.
We're diving into the weird and wonderful world of commercial surety today. I'm excited about it. It should be a lot of fun.
I think it's going to be one of our more unusual podcasts for sure.
So to do that with us today, we've got Amy Pascalide, court probate bond attorney with Markel Surety. Hey, Amy, thanks for being on.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we also have Rosa Martinez-Genzon, partner with Los Angeles office of Anderson, McPharlin Conners LLP. Hey, Rosa, thanks for being on.
Hi, Kat. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we kind of dive in here, Amy, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and about Markel?
Well, I have been in surety for about 10 years now, working as counsel to review claims. I have a background in contract bonds, working with payment and performance bonds, and now I mostly work with court bonds. And the lovely Rosa here is one of the attorneys that we hire most often to help us with our commercial.
That's terrific. Rosa, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your firm?
Sure. So Anderson, McPharlin Conners is located in Los Angeles, like you said. I joined as a third-year attorney, and I've been there 18 years. Don't do the math because I'm still quite young. But basically started doing surety. I think it happened as probably a lot of people where they just said, do you want to do surety? And I said, I don't know what that is, but sure. And then you kind of run with it.
So you kind of started us off there. I was going to ask how you found yourself dealing with commercial bonds. How did you end up there, Rosa?
Well, it was actually the first bonds that you get started off on, I think, because they're kind of a little bit more straightforward. They're based on statute. Usually you're dealing with negligence or fraud. So it's kind of, what you're in your early career, you're kind of trying to develop those skills. So I've been doing commercial bonds since I started in surety.
That's terrific. How'd you find commercial surety, Amy?
I did the opposite. I started in contract, doing all the construction stuff. And when I was at my prior surety, we were kind of cross-training so that the claims people would have an opportunity to help the other teams when there was a need. So I started cross-training in court, and I found it really interesting. It's much more black and white. There's a lot less deference and room for error, and I liked that. I like that about the law. So when there was an opportunity at Markel to do just commercial in court, I jumped on it, and now all of the weird bonds are something we deal with every day.
We're talking about weird bonds, but what makes a bond a weird bond? Amy?
I think not something that you don't see every day. For me, when I first started in contract, the weirdest thing I ever saw was a subdivision bond. And that was strange because it's not just, did we get paid or did we not get paid? But then once I moved to court, you start having things like child custody bonds. And you don't realize that not only are you dealing with the triggers of the statute, but you're also dealing with a lot of personalities and the underlying divorce and the conflict and the fight over the kids and, angry parents at that point calling you, or attorneys who are very emotionally invested calling you. So to me, those go into the category of weird bonds because it's not the everyday that you're dealing with.
I agree with what Amy said. I think it's a bond that you have to take a double take on and figure out what you're doing. Definitely have to review the statute. And I agree, you're dealing with personal issues a lot of times because these statutory bonds deal with commercial issues or businesses, people doing personal transactions in their lives. So you do get a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, and you're kind of almost like a counselor at some points where you're trying to get these parties to agree on something or trying to get them to accept a settlement because it's in their best interest.
Commercial surety is such a broad catch-all term, really. And so it sounds like you're seeing the creativity of regulators and legislators to come up with bond requirements to meet a need, I guess, for compliance or other kinds of security in a certain arrangement. So seems like there could be a lot of unusual bonds in this space. If you continue to see bond requirements come out that surprise you in the commercial surety space, I imagine it's dynamic and evolving over time.
Yeah,
Um,
I think there's always a need for consumer protection, and a lot of these bonds arise because there's also a need for protection of the government and the state, and that comes to paying taxes or paying fees. If you look at like cigarette machine vending bonds, what are those there to protect? It's to make sure that the individual who is running the vending machine pays the taxes and fees related with cigarettes. The same thing for like lottery bonds. Are they paying the taxes and fees related to collection of the funds from lottery tickets? Winemakers bonds is one that Rosa holds close to her heart.
And brewer bonds as well.
Oh,
Brewer
and
bonds,
brewer, okay.
are the winemakers and the brewers, are they paying all of the fees and taxes and complying with the statutes and regulations with those industries? So yeah, I think as long as we have these industries that are trying to protect consumers and fees and taxes and the government, yeah, you're going to continue to see these strange bonds.
I think a lot of these bonds are targeted to when you're signing contracts that most people probably just sign off on and never read the fine print. So as we were preparing for this broadcast, I ran across, like, for example, like health spa bonds, which protect consumers if your gym happens to go out of business and you've paid a fee, so you can go and collect your money from them. It was actually very interesting looking at some of the additional bonds that are offered.
It is interesting. It's a lot of places you wouldn't necessarily expect to see bonding.
Correct.
Right, but it's a solution that maybe a government official has figured out or a legislator, and then they're applying it to solve a problem. Kind of to that end, I remember reading, I think it was in New York State, about an issue on essentially the payment to people working in car washes.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, there seemed to be a bond requirement to solve that. Or, Rosa, are you familiar with that
I believe I
circumstance?
have handled a car wash bond before. And it's interesting too, because they're always connected to the licensing, right? So the state wants you to have these bonds in place because it's issuing a license to you. And it wants you to either not defraud people or steal money or not pay your employees, whatever it might be. So I believe I have, but that was a long time ago. I know that because I don't remember the specifics.
Right, right. But car
Yeah.
wash bond, that's one. And I've heard that there are also bonds for nail salons. Amy, do you ever run across that?
I haven't personally, but those run along the same lines as the car
Okay.
wash bonds. So the nail salon bonds, those are to make sure that the salon is actually paying their nail technicians
Oh,
and for the wages and commissions and things like that. So those nail salon bonds are really popular in New York. And again, the legislature probably found that there was some kind of issue or some kind of gap there, and this is their way of solving that gap. There's also, I think, with Kat, the day we met, we were discussing Geoduck bonds, and those are for environmental cleanup. So if you're running a Geoduck farm or any type of farm where you're going to leave residue or you're going to leave damage to the land or any kind of issue that needs to be cleaned up, the city, state, municipal area that you're working in, they're going to want to make sure that you leave the land the way you found it. So those environmental cleanup bonds also serve a really important purpose. And I think if you kind of just think of it as, what are we trying to fix? How can we fix it? and is a bond an appropriate instrument to do that, then yeah, why not use them?
Right. So, for the benefit of our listeners, just in case there are a few people who don't know what a gooey duck is, does anybody want to try to explain what a gooey duck is? Rosa?
I'm gonna go over to Amy on this one.
Okay, good.
Pass
Pass.
it to Amy. I don't
Pass.
think I've
Yeah,
dealt with
fair.
that
Very
bond
large.
before.
Yeah.
I haven't either, but it's a very large clam.
Okay.
And if you ever watch Iron Chef or any Food Network
Right.
shows, they're always trying to get people to cook with gooey duck because it's just a really funny looking creature.
And
Interesting.
it sounds like, since it's a clam, then people probably have to dig for them, and they're disturbing the environment, the beach, or the river bottom, or wherever they might be, I guess. And so this benefits the state to make sure that area is restored, I would imagine.
Yes,
So,
and proper cleanup.
wow. So, yeah, that's great. So it's nice to hear that there are bonds for nail salons, so that the people working there don't get clipped in their wages. Pardon the pun. Pardon the pun. But yeah. So tell us about some of the other kind of unusual bonds that you hear about. And I know that there are a lot of circumstances. So we talked about the need for compliance, for consumer protection. Seems like those kinds of purposes could arise in so many different contexts. So what are some of the other ones that you can recall?
Well, I've worked on pest control bonds before, which was unique, and it is based on fraud, on making sure that whoever is licensed to come and fumigate your house isn't going to defraud you. Um, and I always
Interesting.
wonder, like, are they telling you they're using one type of poison, but they're not, or where would the fraud arise? The claim that we had was
Right.
with respect to payment of a worker. So it wasn't,
Okay.
someone that had actually directly contracted for services. But it was definitely interesting to know that there's that kind of protection for consumers.
And was that connected to the
Yes,
license for the pest
exactly.
company? Okay. Okay. Interesting.
And I
So,
worked on a housekeeper's bond once. It's not called that. It's called a cleaning service bond, I believe was the
okay.
correct term. And it was a homeowner who contacted the surety and was claiming that her jewelry was stolen by the housekeeper. And she wanted to make a claim on the bond. Well, that bond specifically states that the claimant must obtain a, a judgment against the bondholder. So you would basically have to get the police to listen to you, file a police report, go through with getting a criminal conviction to
Oh,
prove
wow.
that there was actually theft, and then collect from the bond. And when I explained that to the consumer, she was obviously not very happy about that. They wish they could show you a receipt for whatever jewelry they say is missing and make a claim as if it were their homeowner's policy, but they don't work like that. And a lot of the bonds, I believe the statutory bonds have that same type of liability triggered, I guess, depending on the bond. But you do have to jump through some hoops and prove up your claim, just like any other bond claim.
That's really interesting, Amy. That difference really shows, it highlights the difference between insurance and surety with what you're saying.
Yeah, there's a huge difference. And
Yeah.
explaining that, especially in the context of commercial bonds, because you are dealing with such a wide range of individuals coming to the surety, learning to explain that and explaining it in a way that they can understand is always really helpful, and helpful to myself when I'm learning about all these bonds too, so that I can understand it.
It's very interesting. I imagine the penal sum is not always very large on some of these bonds. I guess then the legislator, the regulator is very careful about crafting who can claim in the process. It sounds like, because otherwise, can't have the universe claiming on these bonds, particularly on the smaller bonds. Is that would you say that's a true statement in terms of what you see out there on these kinds of bonds?
Yeah, definitely a true statement. The bond I was discussing was, I believe it was a $5,000 bond. It wouldn't have been more than 10,000. But when Rosa and I were looking yesterday and talking about some of these bonds, we found a dance studio bond, and
Okay.
those bonds can range up to $50,000. And
Oh, wow.
when you're talking about coverage for a dance studio, if the dance studio takes fees ahead of time for classes paid in the future and then closes down, you're supposed to be able to collect from the bond to get reimbursed and things like that. But how many people spend, $50,000? I guess it's combined, so you'd have multiple claimants. But if you're
Right.
comparing that to like a license bond, a contractor's license bond, those used to be $15,000. What's the harm? The person who's having their home redone and their roof collapses because of a negligent contractor, that's going to be a heck of a lot closer to the 50,000 or more range. So it is interesting to see the different penal sums on these different bonds.
I always wonder how it is that they pick those numbers, because they do seem kind of not necessarily to relate to what the reality is if you're having construction in your house, and how much it costs to really do any type of project in your house, and what kind of loss you can experience versus having some of these bonds that you wouldn't think would cause that much harm, in the $50,000 range or $25,000 range or whatever it might be.
You would hope that some of the legislators would actually speak with the surety industry and gather their expertise and their thoughts before they actually put them into play and enact legislation. But that isn't always the case,
That's
right?
always the dream.
Um, right, exactly. Another situation I'm reminded of a dangerous dog bond, because I think there are some circumstances that have occurred, and then they probably decided they needed to enact that. Rosa, have you heard about that
I
bond?
have heard about it.
And
I don't know if California has a similar type of bond. I didn't see one when we were kind of, again, preparing for this, but we did see an exotic animal bond. I know Amy
okay,
looked into that.
Yeah, in states like Florida, and states where you have a lot of imports of exotic animals, where the animals are legal but still considered dangerous, they do require either the sellers or the owners of the exotic animals to carry a bond. So if the animal harms anyone, the person harmed is protected, or if the animal gets out and it costs the state money to go retrieve the animal, or if the animal gets out and starts reproducing and causes issues in the environment, it covers many different types of loss. And then the dangerous dog bite or the dangerous dog bonds, those are usually breed specific,
right,
which
Okay.
I always thought was funny, because if you look at it, it's Chihuahuas and Dachshunds are the most likely to bite. But those two types of dogs are never the types that are required to be bonded, because if a Chihuahua bites you, you're going to go get a couple stitches. If a Doberman bites you, even though it's probably less likely to happen, it's going to cause a lot more damage or harm. So those are
right.
bonded at a higher level.
Yeah,
That's
I think there were a lot of I think they were concerned about pit bulls and some of those types of dogs, and it was enacted for that reason. But you would hope Florida would have an exotic animal bond, given their python problem they currently have in South
yeah.
Florida. But so the other area that I've seen is in kind of boxing and other sports like that. That sometimes there are bond requirements. Is that something, Amy, that you can elaborate a little bit more on?
I've never had to deal with one personally, but I did look into them. There is a combative sports promoter bond. So the promoters of MMA or boxing or those types of sports are required to be bonded. I would assume that has something to do with the prizes and making sure that the games, the matches are fought fairly and that there isn't any cheating and things like that going on. But those bonds can range anywhere from $1,000 to $50,000. So there is
Oh,
a
Wow.
wide
wow.
range, and it depends on whether you are representing someone who's an amateur or who's a professional in the sport.
That makes sense. Yeah. It's so interesting that you can find bonding in all these unusual places and industries. So what do you do when you see one of these weird bonds come across your desk? Well, how do you approach this when it's not something you've ever seen before? Amy, what do you do?
I panic. Uh, I take lots of deep breaths. I might take a break and go get myself a big glass of ice water to calm myself down. And then when I get back to my desk, I read the bond language. The bond language is always very informative, especially if it's a statutory bond. It'll
Mm,
reference a statute or reference a multitude of statutes. And then I go look those up. And if those aren't helpful enough, most states have general bonding statutes that discuss who can be a claimant, what the bond liabilities are, things like that. So just basically looking at the bond, looking at all of the laws first. And then once I have an understanding of why that bond exists, what it's trying to protect, how the liability is triggered, then I look into the actual claim facts. Because if I look at the claim facts first, you can be persuaded whether you want to or not by a persuasive argument from a claimant or a persuasive argument from a principal. So I don't like to look at those first. I like to learn what I'm looking at and then start looking at everyone else's arguments.
that makes sense. Rosa, how do you approach it when something comes across your desk you've never seen
I think in the
before?
same manner, you definitely start with the bond because the bond is going to point you in the right direction in terms of what statute you're going to apply and what the different elements are that a claimant is going to have to prove. Most of these bonds don't have any case law associated with them. So it's not something, like
Mm,
when you have a CLB bond or an MBD bond, you're going to go and look to see maybe what the courts have held and how they've applied the different fraud elements or whatever it might be. So it is really an interpretation and delving through the facts and trying to figure out, is this really covered under this bond? Was it the intent of the bond? Um, it is interesting because you are being very creative and kind of thinking outside the box.
Well, and you both have been involved in the surety industry for a while now, so I'm sure you understand the value of surety bonding. But why do you think that these bonds exist? Why is the surety tool a good tool in these unusual cases?
I think with respect to licensing bonds, I think it's to remind the individuals who are applying for these licenses that they have a responsibility to the public, and that they can be held liable if they violate whatever the statutes require or defraud or negligence. So I think it is a way for the legislator to kind of not just hand out licenses to whoever applies for them. And
Mm.
there's always a credit check, though. We don't always know how truthful they're being or whatever it might be, but it is a way to put this in front of them and to say you do have this responsibility.
Yep, I agree. I agree. And I think, protecting the consumer is something that the legislature is always going to want to say that they're doing a good job of looking at and a good job of taking care of. So by having these types of bonds, it not only gives the licensing agency something like a dollar amount that they can say that they're protecting the consumer up to, but also it kind of puts the onus on someone other than the licensing agency to look at and see if the liability on these things is triggered. So I think it kind of also distributes the effort and distributes the work to make sure that the consumer is protected.
That's terrific. Well, now we can, when we're out, we're driving on roads that are bonded for the building of those roads and buildings that were bonded and parks that the construction of those parks was bonded. And when we're getting gooey duck, we're also supporting the bonding industry. It was awesome having you guys on with us today and just talking about all these interesting and unusual bonds that we can find in commercial surety. Hopefully we can get you guys back again and you'll have some more weird bonds coming across your desk that we can talk about.
You've been listening to Let's Get Surety, brought to you by the National Association of Surety Bond Producers. For more information about the NASBP and its members, visit nasbp.org.
Before we go, we just want to say thank you again to Old Republic Surety for their generous support in sponsoring this episode of Let's Get Surety. For more information on Old Republic Surety, visit www.orsurety.com.